30 years ago today, it was very cold in Florida at the Kennedy Space Center. The pads had been readied, both pads for the first time, a space shuttle on 39A and 39B. Since the Space Shuttle Columbia, which was the 24th flight, was so late getting off the ground, indeed, the better part of a month from the first start and for 4 scrubs starting December the 19th, but finally launching after the 5th try into a flawless 6-day mission on January the 12th to return to Earth on January the 16th. To return to Earth on January the 18th. In the meantime, on the other Space Shuttle launch pad, Challenger, the 25th flight, is being readied. The night before the day of the launch, which is 30 years ago today, it was exceptionally cold in Florida. It got down to 25 degrees. Indeed, there were actually icicles hanging on the launch tower. And as the crew arrived to get in the early morning hours, and there were holes all the way up until a little past 11 o'clock. At this point, the temperature had improved to 36 degrees. Still, the icicles were there, but it was above freezing. And there was considerable consternation throughout the entire apparatus of NASA and its contractors, particularly the top managers, as well as the managers of the company that made the solid rocket boosters, as to whether or not there should be a launch. And the go was given. 73 seconds high into the sky above Florida, Challenger disintegrated, and to a nation that had come to think that climbing in the space shuttle was like getting in your car and taking a Sunday afternoon drive. Indeed, this was quite a shock because the entire technological prowess of the country 30 years ago was summed up in this magnificent flying machine that would go to orbit and would come back, that would take 45,000 pounds of payload to orbit and would come back and land like an airplane, albeit without an engine. But that morning, it was to be different. The only other astronauts that we had lost were in getting ready for the Apollo program to go to the moon. On the pad, in just a countdown test of the Apollo capsule, which the environment was an oxygen-rich environment, one of the 3 astronauts doing the practice countdown happened to kick a part of the spacecraft that had a wire that set an ignition, and in that oxygen-rich environment, fire engulfed and claimed the lives of Gus Grissom and Ed White and Roger Chaffee. And all those years, when we did not even know what was going to happen when we went into space. When we launched John Glenn on that Atlas rocket that we knew had a 20% chance of failure, we didn't know enough about the human body in zero gravity and at those speeds to know what was going to happen to the human body. And in all those years of experimentation and going to the moon many times, even on the ill-fated Apollo 13, that we thought we had 3 dead men in the Apollo capsule when that explosion occurred en route to the moon, and yet miraculously, this space industry and NASA apparatus came together and figured out real time how to get them back and get them back safely in a crew headed by Jim Lovell. But it was not to be, Mr. President. On the morning of January the 28th, 1986, I have a scale model of 1 to 100 of the space shuttle, and I want to explain what happened that morning. As Challenger launched, it went through its sequence where they had to throttle back on the main engines as they went through the part of the atmosphere getting maximum dynamic pressure, and then those famous words that came back from the crew that they were acknowledging your go at throttle up. The 3 main engines ignited, burning in the tail of the space shuttle, fueled by the liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen contained in the external fuel tank. They throttled up to 100%, and it was straight up and accelerating. Here's what happened at 73 seconds. The solid rocket boosters, so you can see from the rear view, are attached by struts to the external tank, which does not hold their fuel. Their fuel is a solid fuel. It has the consistency of that eraser on this pencil. And those ignite at T-0, each with about 3 million pounds of thrust. You definitely know you're going somewhere. And so it was. But the cold weather had dealt us a devil's brew that day, because these joints where they put together the solid rocket booster are sealed with a rubberized gasket. And those rubber O-rings, because of the cold weather, had gotten stiff and brittle to the point at which it just so happened that a point over close to the external tank, the hot gases of thrust, instead of coming out the nozzle in the tail of the solid rocket booster, are coming out because the joint is not sealed because of that rubberized O-ring that has now become stiff and brittle from the cold weather, and the hot gases burned into the external tank, and that caused the explosion that all of us remember. That was played over and over again on our television screens. And that was what was such a shock to the American people. And those 7 souls, led by Dick Scobie as the mission commander, a test pilot, by Mike Smith, the pilot in NASA terminology, the co-pilot, a test pilot. Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher from New Hampshire. Greg Jarvis, a payload specialist. Judy Resnick, a mission specialist. Ron McNair, mission specialist. And Ellison Onizuka, a mission specialist. Those 7 souls perished as all of the explosion fell miles and miles down to the surface waters of the ocean and eventually the debris on the floor of the ocean. There is a dramatic presentation at the Kennedy Space Center in the Atlantis exhibit showing a part of the Challenger. And anybody who goes to the Kennedy Space Center, I would urge them to go and see that. It's a very moving exhibit, and it's an exhibit about the crew. But Mr. President, that exhibit is not only about Challenger, which was 30 years ago, but that exhibit is about the next space shuttle that we lost. That was some 16, 17 years later. And it was on February the 1st of 2003. And it was the Space Shuttle Columbia, the one that had launched just previous to Challenger, the one of which this senator was privileged to be a part of the crew. And this time, it was destroyed, but for a different reason, because it had launched a couple of weeks early, and everything was fine, so we thought. But it was not to be. Because what happened on launch was that this external fuel tank carrying the very, very cold liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, in order to keep that cold, is surrounded with an insulation. And there's a part of that insulation that broke off that is about the size of a styrofoam insulated tub, about this big. That's all. That was all the size. And it broke off right here as Columbia was on ascent. And as it accelerated and the speeds became very, very high, that piece of foam fell with high velocity right at the leading edge of the left wing. That is a carbon-carbon fiber, very light in weight, but very resistant to heat. On re-entry, the front edges of the wing and the tip of the nose, all carbon fiber, get up to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And of course, everything was fine with a hole in the left leading edge of the wing as Columbia ascent 8.5 minutes to orbit. But now, February the 1st, it's time to come home. And this crew of 7 was about to meet their fate as they had done the deorbit burn, had fallen through space for a half hour, started encountering the upper reaches of the atmosphere. And as the leading edge of the wing, now the orbiter separated and flying to begin with more like an airplane on descent. As the leading edge of the wing heated up, there's a hole in it on the left side, and the hot gases go in and burn up the wing. And on re-entry, high over Texas, Columbia burned up, and the debris fell over miles and miles of Texas. Rick Husband, the commander, Willie McCool, the pilot, Mike Anderson, payload commander, David Brown, mission specialist, Kalpana Chawla, mission specialist, Laurel Clark, mission specialist, and Ilan Ramon, payload specialist. The test pilot, the hero of the Israeli Air Force that led the strike on Saddam Hussein's nuclear plant outside of Baghdad. Ilan Ramon had been chosen to fly on the space shuttle. I remember one time that I was seeing the former president of Israel, Shimon Peres, and he knew of my background, and he said, I want you to see this telecommunications that I got from Ilan Ramon the day before the reentry. And he was saying, Mr. President, I want to thank you on behalf of the Israeli people for giving me the opportunity. The fact that you and then President Clinton had enabled me to be able to start in this astronaut program and to be able to fly. And the mission was just incredible. And President Peres shared how that was so meaningful to him only a few hours before Columbia did the deorbit burn and into the pages of history. Mr. President, so it is solemn that we come here today to pay tribute 30 years ago to the Challenger crew and also to the Columbia crew. It's solemn, but what they sacrificed and what the Apollo 1 astronauts sacrificed and what so many other astronauts in training have sacrificed through training mishaps, what they sacrificed is not forgotten and it's not in vain. Because, Mr. President, we're going to Mars. Now, it's not going to look like this because we learned our lesson. This was a fantastic flying machine, but it was an inherently risky design because the crew here in the orbiter is on the side of the stack of explosives. And as a result, I've just explained to you two of the terrible tragedies that occurred. No, the new rockets that will fly in less than 2 years, in September of 2017, to and from the International Space Station on American rockets, the new rockets look like they've gone back to the old Apollo design, but in fact, the new rockets have much updated crew compartment spacecraft that will sit on the top of the rocket so that if you have an explosion, even on the pad, all the way to orbit, you can save the lives of the crew by detaching with the explosive rockets the spacecraft away from the explosion and save the crew by it either landing under its own power or having parachutes that will let it down gently. So, Mr. President, in light of this 30th anniversary, given the fact that we as a nation who are by our nature explorers and adventurers, we never want to give that up. That's a part of our DNA. It's a part of our character. It's a part of our vision. We used to go westward as we developed this country into that new frontier. Now we continue to go upward. And Mr. President, we're going to Mars. And that's going to be a great day in the decade of the 2030s, but you will see us build on that in 2 years, launching Americans on new spacecraft on the top of rockets, and in 3 years, a full-up test of the largest rocket ever put together by mankind on the face of this planet, the Space Launch System and its spacecraft, Orion. That will do its first full-up test flight in 2018. So in the memory of Challenger crew, in the memory of the Columbia crew, in the memory of the Apollo 1 crew, we stand on their shoulders as we continue to explore the heavens. We thank them for their courage, their sacrifice, their pioneering spirit. And that's what I wanted to share on this 30th anniversary of the tragedy of the Space Shuttle Challenger.